What's up, everyone? This is Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner, and today I'm going to be reviewing the JBL HDI 4500 center channel. It's the speaker that's over the shoulder right here. Normally, when I do reviews, I do my videos, I try to church them up a little bit. I mean, I definitely don't have the best video production quality out there, but I try to do a little something. But I'm just so bogged down with everything right now that I don't have the time to really sit and go through and edit a bunch of stuff. So I'm going to try to do something a little bit different today. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the streaming platform that I've been using, and I'm going to actually walk through the data in real time. So this is kind of quasi live, if you will. And you'll just have to kind of forgive me for any foibles. There we go. See, I've already made one. Foibles that I may make along the way. But anyway, yeah, I figured, it would be useful for me to provide some explanation for this data that I already have on my website rather than just posting it up there and not really mentioning it, because I feel like it needs to be discussed at least to some degree. So, with that said, I am going to switch over now and start going through this, and we can talk about the results. So here we are at my website. This is aaronsaudiocorner.com, and I've got the JBL HDI 4500 center channel speaker right behind me, actually, as you can see just over my shoulder. Now, what we see here is a speaker with four woofers and a tweeter waveguide. Now, these four woofers aren't all playing the same bandpass. Now, what you've got here is on the end, this woofer and this woofer are actually more like mid bass. They play up to about 600 hertz, and then they cross over to the mid ranges, which continue to play on until about 2200 hertz. So this design is a 2.5 way. Instead of being a 2-way or a 3-way, it's a 2.5. And the half comes into play because you have overlap between these two. Again, the end woofers play up to 600 hertz and then fall off. And these continue on up until about 2200 hertz for the acoustic crossover slope. The reason for that is because the distance between this woofer and this woofer is so large that if you try to play them up to a higher frequency, then they would have lobing effects. They basically would no longer act like a single wavefront source, and that would affect the off axis response and also probably the on axis response as well. I mean, it could be dialed in to be smooth, but it would not be ideal, I guess is the best way to put it. So they limit these outer woofers to a lower bandpass region and then allow the inner woofers, mid ranges, to continue on to mate to the tweeter. So that's the idea of the design. And yeah, I'll put some other stuff in here. So this is just a bunch of stuff that I've copied from the JBL website, and also wanted to note that JBL was kind enough to loan me this speaker along with the JBL HDI 3800 tower speakers to review. And if you want to go back, you can read this stuff. It's just, some things that I thought worth mentioning, but I didn't want to get bogged down into it too much because this information is out there for everybody. The price is $17.50 for the single speaker. And then here are some general takeaways. Let's see here, 90 dB sensitivity rating, nominal impedance of 4 ohm. Here's a power rating, the weight and the size. And like I said, the crossover is 600 hertz for the mid woofer to mid range, and then 2200 hertz from the mid range to the tweeter. And again, this is a 2.5-way design. It also says bass reflex, so it's a ported enclosure. And go around and see the back. You see these two ports right here, and then you can see the binding post here. You can biamp them if you want. Honestly, that's something I never really do, and I'm not going to waste time really talking about that. Now, this is a picture of the speaker set up in my living room when I was using it for listening purposes. And generally, what I did with this speaker is I just summed the source sound from stereo to mono, and I use it to listen to music and also watch Netflix and movies with, to get a sense of how does this react for dialogue, because dialogue is the main purpose of a center channel, and a lot of the information is steered toward that center channel with dialogue in mind. And then you have the stereo speakers flanking the center channel for the panning effects and or music. So here we go into the spin data, and here's a note about what the spin data is, how I obtain it. I do it using the Klippel near field scanner, and if you're curious about what that is or how it works, I have about a 2-hour discussion with one of the designers from Klippel, Christian Bellman, who is a young genius in his own right. This is a picture of the near field scanner and the speaker in my garage set up, ready to go. And you can see that the axis of measurement here is the tweeter axis. And the speaker is set up horizontally like you would a typical center channel speaker, because this is how it's going to be used in most applications. Even though a toppled MTM type design is not ideal, that's how they're used generally. And then I just kind of make sure to note that information. And I'll also say that the speaker was, there was no grill, and that the port was not plugged. So this was the ported configuration. And here we go into the Spinorama results, and the black is the on axis. And I'll note real fast, I do plan to create a video that talks about what all this stuff means. That's not this video. This is going to be more of the highlights. But if you're interested in all this information, where this comes from, what this stuff means, you can click this link. You can actually download the CTA 2034 specification yourself. Or, to kind of give yourself a shortcut, you can click this little down arrow, and this talks about the different curves that you see in the below graphic. So starting off, we're looking at the on-axis response, which is in black. And for the most part, the on-axis response is pretty smooth. I mean, we see some jaggedness going on here. You're getting a lot of that in speakers that are reviewed with an anechoic chamber or the near-field scanner. And the reason you see that in these kind of measurements, but not other people's measurements, like with quasi-anechoic measurements, is simply because quasi-anechoic measurements are gated usually to around 300 hertz or so, which means that you only have a data point around every 300 hertz or so. You don't have the fine nitty-gritty details that an anechoic chamber or the near-field scanner will provide. And in this case, I have measurement resolution down to, like, I don't know, like every 2 hertz or something, which is huge. 2 hertz versus 300 hertz resolution. You can understand why you typically will see more smooth results with other outlets. That's not a knock. That's just explanation of why you see all these things going. It doesn't necessarily mean that the speaker is terrible. And a lot of this stuff your ear kind of audibly smooths anyway, but it's worth noting. And the only thing that really stands out to me in this speaker is this trough in the mid range. And it's really not even that big of a trough. I mean, if you're looking at it, it's probably about maybe minus 1.5 dB, if that. I mean, it's really not that big. But for the nitpicky, that's going to present itself as more of a hollow sound in the mid range. And for a center channel speaker, that kind of concerns me, because if anything, maybe you could argue that you want a boosted mid range effect. I'm not saying that you do, but I'm just saying if somebody were to make the argument for that, I could say, okay, that's somewhat reasonable for a center channel. And then going on above that out to 1K, you see a couple little things here and there. And they are resonance because they show up in the off axis response as well. So each of these others are some form of off axis measurements. But then extending on out, you see a dip at about 10K, very, very narrow, like more like a notch dip. And then some peakingness above 15K. Now, I noted further down in this review that I don't know if these things are audible. I didn't hear them because I wasn't specifically listening for them, but I never noticed an issue when listening for them. So take that for what it's worth. Now, the listening window is defined as plus or minus 30 degrees to the side, plus or minus 10 degrees up and down or above and below the speaker. So what we're seeing here is that the listening window is starting to vary from the on axis response, which is not ideal. And the reason that it's varying is because of the directivity of the speaker itself, because of that long distance you have between one end woofer to the other end woofer starts to show up in a directivity mismatch. And we see that here in the, what is this, the 500-600 region, where at about 100 hertz, you're starting to go up and you're trending. And then you can see something disrupts that trend upward and you drop back down. So this basically means you're radiating more forward, more forward, more forward. Now you're not, and you're still not until you get to about 2 kilohertz. So that is a directivity mismatch. And if this were a floor standing speaker, this would concern me more. But given that it is a center channel with an MTM type design just laid over on its side, I'm not forgiving it, but I expect it. This is just one of the uh, takeaways, or I don't know, I can't think of the word right now, but this is just something that you have to live with a center channel when it's laid over on its side. your options are to stand the speaker up, but you're not going to be able to stand the speaker up in front of your television. That's just not feasible, right? So with most people in living room type situations, where the center channel is placed below their television, this is what you're going to get. This is kind of par for the course. So now let's look at the early reflections, and we can see again, just a lot of this information is just telling us, yes, there is a directivity mismatch in the mid-range area, which this comes up a little bit further below. So I'm going to go ahead and skip down to the to that information. But here is an early reflections breakout, and this kind of defines right here what the early reflections consist of and how they're defined. And the takeaway here is really that the sidewall bounce results in a pretty significant dip off axis in the mid range area. And we're going to come to that again. And this is the estimated in room response. If you're sitting on axis, this is kind of what you could expect to hear. So you see a more troughed mid range, a peakiness around the 1 kilohertz region, and then a more flat on axis response at the seated position is what's predicted here. Now, is this ideal? No, it's not ideal. Ideal, for most people is going to be a negative 1 dB per octave slope. So just kind of imagine drawing an imaginary line through here. This peakiness right here concerns me. And the fact that it is flat on axis, I think it's going to present itself as um, potentially somewhat bright, a little bit too hot in the, I don't know if this isn't necessarily the presence region, but the 1 to 2 kilohertz region. To me, this is going to sting a little bit. Now, it's not significant. I'd say ballparking it is maybe it's about 3 dB. And I think that this is more apparent because of this. I think if this weren't troughed as much as it is, then this would be fine. So it's one problem, you know, depending on which side you're looking at. Is it the trough or is it the peak? Well, in this case, I really think it's the trough. So, but having said that, this is kind of how you're going to hear things. It's going to stand out to you in this region relative to the mid range. So, this is the horizontal SPL plus or minus 90 degrees. And the takeaway for me here is that the further you go off axis, so this is on axis with the dark red, and then each one of these lines are going off axis further and further until you get to the this pinkish color. The further you get off axis, the more troughed this mid range is. Now, this is an issue for center channel speakers because unless it's just you and you're sitting on axis, you're going to have your friends sitting to the side of the screen or of you or of the center channel speaker, and naturally they're going to have some kind of negative effect of this. They're going to not hear the speech dialogue as well as the main listening position will on axis. And you can see that about 20 degrees is when, to me, this is, I'd say 20 degrees plus or minus 20 degrees is the maximum off axis I would go, because then you get in the yellow at 30 degrees and that just troughs off even more. And then you just all sorts of problems. So as far as mid range goes, mid range clarity, dialogue, don't get any further than plus or minus 20 degrees. And in fact, I would say plus or minus 10 degrees would be more ideal. Any further than that, you're not going to have good speech intelligibility. I think I said it right without even stumbling over it. And this is the vertical response. So this is basically you standing up, above or below the speaker as it's aimed toward you on axis. And these actually all look pretty good. I mean, plus or minus 40 degrees. 40 degrees is a pretty big swing. And these are all bunched up pretty close together, which means that within reason, as long as the speaker is aimed, within, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 degrees, your response is going to be pretty even, going above and below the speaker. Not not a drastic change, and that's ideal, but it's typically more ideal in the horizontal spectrum because most people aren't moving height wise other than a few inches, so that may be less than 5 degrees delta. But side to side is where things change in a movie theater, or a home theater. So now we go and look at, now this is just the same thing as the horizontal data I presented above. It's just in a different way of looking at it. And personally, I don't like this format of looking at it. So I'm going to skip through it. Other people do. That's the only reason I provide it. And this is the same thing, vertical, but just provided in a different format. I'm going to skip that. And then we get into the impedance. Now the impedance there is EPDR. Gosh, I have to go look it up because this is still new to me. Equivalent peak dissipation resistance. So I'm not going to harp on this too much because honestly, this isn't my bag. I don't know a lot about EPDR. This is very new to me. I'm just going to focus instead on the blue impedance. And for those of you wondering, well, why even provide EPDR? Because some people, maybe even you, know what it is, understand how useful it can be, and would benefit from having that information. And I would rather go ahead and provide it now than not ever have it at all, because at some point this will make sense to me. It'll click one day, right? Um, so let's look at the blue impedance. So we can see that the impedance never dips below 4 ohm. They say it's a nominal 4 ohm speaker. I mean, yeah, it's definitely a nominal 4 ohm speaker. It's maybe even nominal a little bit above 4 ohm. Harmonic distortion, and this is at 89 dB at 1 meter equivalent. And we can see that the negative 40 dB right here is relative to the fundamental. So whatever frequency or whatever sound you're listening to, these values are relative to that. So this means that the distortion is 40 dB down from the fundamental on-axis response, and negative 40 dB is equivalent to about 1%. So you can see that in general, yeah, this speaker is below 1% THD at 89 dB until you get to the really low frequencies. We'll touch on that in a little bit. And then at 97 dB, which is pretty darn loud at 1 meter, your still mid range is well below the 1% THD. And then you get a little bit above that when you start getting into the crossover region for the tweeter. And then let's see here on the low end again, yeah, you're creeping up above that. So about the low end, I'll go ahead and mention it now. In my listening test, I never heard any plopping or anything, mechanical with the speaker going awry. And that's a great thing. But still, you're going to want a subwoofer for it, because let's go back and look at the on axis response. And you can see that it's really not a steep fall off. It's a pretty good fall off. And in most rooms, you're probably looking down to maybe 50 to 60 hertz. But I would still generally recommend the 60 to 80 hertz crossover region for this speaker. And that's just kind of a general wag at it. Everybody's different, and your listening levels really kind of drive that as well. But that's my opinion. Now, a glow plot. So the horizontal data that we talked about earlier, this is the same data. It's just put into what I feel is a more intuitive way of looking at it. And what we have represented here is a top-down bird's eye view of the speaker's horizontal radiation pattern. 0 degrees is out in front of the speaker, so where you'd be listening. 180 degrees is at the back of the speaker. Negative 90 and plus 90 are to the sides of the speaker. So again, you're looking top down at the speaker's radiation pattern. And the thing that I noticed right away, so the red is the more higher SPL region. And if you look, you can see that there's a whole lot of yellow and orange off to the side here. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at this. If we're talking about angles, in terms of angles, 0 degrees comes straight down here, plus or minus 10 degrees off to the side, plus or minus 20 degrees off to the side. So what this is really telling me that I'm taking away is above 200 hertz until about, this lines up with 1.3 kilohertz, you are pretty good in the mid-range, off axis up to about plus or minus 20 degrees. So the same thing we talked about before, it still applies here. It's just a different way of looking at it. However, you can see that between 1.3 and about 2 kilohertz or so, following this around, there's kind of a hole in the response at about 20 degrees. And so that leads me to recommend, hey, if you can squeeze it in tighter, if you can pack it in, or if you've got a large room where you can put that center channel further away, and that 10 degrees now isn't 2 feet, it's 4 feet distance, so you've got enough room for your buddies on the side, stick with that 10 degrees. But I'm recommending at most do not go beyond 20 degrees off axis horizontally, because then you start getting into all of this. And all of this is the mid range frequencies. This is like 200 hertz to 800 hertz, and there's hardly anything there. You're down, if I'm looking at the scale right, you're down anywhere from, roughly 20 dB to about 10 dB, just depending on exactly where you are in here. So this is very paramount to providing you with information on where to sit. Sit plus or minus 20 degrees, no more than that, because, and it's not just from the data, I heard it very clearly. Once you go beyond that angle, the speech just kind of falls off, and you're like, okay. And so if you're watching a movie, you hear all these sound effects and people are talking in the middle of it, you're not going to hear the people talking. You're going to hear all the sound effects taking over, and that wouldn't be ideal. So going on, this is kind of the same thing, but now this is with the vertical response. So this is looking from the side of the speaker. 0 degrees is the listener out here, plus 90 degrees, minus 90 degrees. So top of the speaker, bottom of the speaker. And then plus minus 180 degrees is the back of the speaker. And in general, this says the same thing that we talked about before. You're looking pretty good, plus or minus 40 degrees. I mean, it's still quite good up until maybe the highest frequency. So this is about 13, somewhere in that 10K region. You get a strong dip here, which we saw previously in the on axis response around the 10K. So, I mean, yeah, plus or minus 30 degrees, you're going to hear pretty much the exact same thing that, the person listening on axis does. Meaning, well, I guess I should say nobody's going to sit above the person, listening to the speaker. But what I mean to say is, as far as angling the speaker goes, if you're unable, to put it at ear height, you can put it reasonably high off the floor and just tilt it up and you'll be okay. And if you can't get it exactly 0 degrees on axis, your ears lined up with the tweeter, then you got some leeway here, vertically speaking. So not a big deal as far as vertical positioning goes. And then here's some parting random thoughts. So this is where I get into a little bit of the uh, essential flaw of the center channel design. So let me pop out here and throw my ugly mug back up here real fast. Okay. With a center channel, when you have a speaker laid over on its side, you have those issues that I talked about with lobing from one speaker to another. And lobing is just off axis cancellation. So, you've got a speaker kind of firing at you, and then you've got another one over here firing at you. And at some angle, their radiation patterns aren't consistent. So instead of overlapping and just kind of, I guess, helping each other out, they say, "Hey, dude, I'm missing 2K here," and you're like, "Hey, I've got plenty of 2K," and they go, and they just fight each other. They fight each other, right? Okay, that is just the inherent nature of what people call a toppled MTM, mid tweeter, mid design, basically where you have the tweeter flanked by a mid range and or mid woofers. The best thing to do is to use an acoustically transparent screen and put the speaker right behind the screen, and then that way you're using all the same LCR speakers and they're all vertically positioned. That way you don't have to worry about any off-axis lobing. I mean, vertical lobing is still going to be an issue, but like I said, you're sitting roughly at the same height every time. I mean, 5 degrees isn't much when you're talking about how far away you typically are, or I guess I should say in terms of height distance. 5 degrees gives you a lot of room for error. But when you're talking about side to side, if you don't have a lot of room for error like you do in a center channel speaker like this or other designs like this, then you suffer those issues of lobing and off axis, inadequacies. So ideally, you want to make sure that you use the same speaker LCR and standing upright. And unfortunately, people just can't do that. Not everybody has the means to put an acoustically transparent screen up, or find some other way to rig something like that up. So you're stuck. I hate to say the word stuck, but you're left with using the center channel laid over on its side. And that's just the nature of the beast here in regards to center channel speakers. So, I don't want to give off the impression that I think this is a bad speaker. It's not actually. For what it is, it's pretty good, but you just have to understand the limitations of such a design. If you were to stand this speaker up, it would be a different game, in my opinion. You have other things that you can let go of. The actual on-axis frequency response and the response within plus or minus 10 degrees or out to plus or minus 20 degrees horizontally is actually pretty good. I mean, the on-axis response is almost flat. Like, that's really good. And as I said, you have that little mild dip in the mid range. And then above 10 kilohertz, you have some things going on too. But for the most part, the speaker is quite good on axis. It has a good bit of output. I mean, I had it about 100 dB at 4 meters and never had any issues. There was no audible mechanical issues, no resonances to speak of, no port chuffing, no speakers bottoming out, and there was no distortions that I heard. It's just that placement and listening position is critical with a speaker like this. So with that said, I'm going to end it here, try to edit a few things together, so fix my technical issues. But I hope you guys appreciate it, and I hope you learned something. And if you have any questions, make sure to leave comments below. And yeah, that's it. So you guys take care, and I'll talk to you later. Peace.